I'll start with the introductions. So it's my honor to have actually Richard Svindland here. He's president of California American Water and Hawaii American Water, and he's been really involved in a lot of projects that are really around water, both in sort of treating wastewater as well as creating desalination plants. And so when I first knew about Richard on National Geographic. Actually, I was looking at National Geographic and I saw this project for this desalination plant in Monterey Bay, and I thought, wow, this is great. This is the future. Water, is an issue, and so it took me a while to track you down on email, but ultimately I got to you, and I asked them to come over to just give us a seminar that kind of explains the process of how you go through making a desalination plant work, all the policy, the engineering, the science. And so this week, in conjunction with the Ocean Vision, actually Richard came here in Georgia, and there's a reason for that. So Richard is actually a graduate from Georgia Tech. He got a civil environmental engineering degree in 1990, and after that he worked for 28 years, in all these engineering projects. So he's really very knowledgeable. And right now, he sits on different boards of directors, including the California Chamber, which is a House of Chambers. I don't know.
No, it's like Chamber of Commerce, but basically so people don't realize California has depends on who you talk to, either the 5th or the 6th largest economy in the world.
Yeah.
So being on the board of the chamber is pretty good. Yeah.
Anyway, so with that said, the way we're gonna have this seminar today is not Richard is going to talk, but we're going to ask questions, interact with Richard during the seminar, because a lot of things are going to come up. And, I'm sure when I first talked to him, I was so curious I couldn't have him finish a sentence. So if you feel that way, please ask questions, and we could just, we have about an hour of time, so we could just take it leisurely. Plus, we're very small today.
Yeah, and just to be fair, afterwards, if you're interested, I've got plenty of time. My next phone call is 7 p.m. tonight, because my crew in California is still working, right? So anyway, but I'm happy to be here.
Richard, thank you. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, go ahead.
All right, so let's start off with some basic water stuff. Does everyone know where your water, like if you went to the water fountain in this building, where does the water come from? Chattahoochee, excellent. And above that? Lanier. Okay, so I'm going to kind of, because you know this, I'm going to kind of, when I talk through the Monterey issues, I'll say this is the equivalent of the Chattahoochee, or this is the equivalent of the Lanier, to give you kind of a basis, right? The water treatment plant is located at the end of 14th Street, the Hemphill plant, right? The firm I worked for here in Atlanta when I got out of college was the firm that designed that facility back. It has a long history, and Atlanta Water Works has been around forever. So I'll use some comparisons back and forth. So there's basically 2 types of drinking water sources for potable water. Potable is what we ingest. There's surface water and there's groundwater. That's it. And surface waters are rivers, lakes, streams, creeks, and ultimately the ocean. Okay, that's your source. Groundwater is pretty much rainwater that flows through the ground and sits in underground aquifers. As you get closer to the coast, that groundwater can be impacted by saltwater intrusion, and they call that brackish source. So that's all you really need to know. And I'll tell the whole story of the Monterey Peninsula Water Supply Project. Surface water, groundwater. You'll hear people talk about conservation and recycling. Those are all programs within those 2, but when you talk about original source, you have surface water and you have groundwater. All right, so any arrow, any button to go down?
Yes, so that one.
Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about Monterey. Monterey, California's water is complex, it's just the reality of it, but Monterey is a kind of a Mediterranean type climate. Average rainfalls are not very high, between 10 and 15, about 10 inches a year is about it. The drought of record in Georgia is 29 inches of rain, the drought of record.
Can you please, sorry, I don't know anything about California.
Okay.
Where is Monterey?
Monterey, it's considered Central Coast, so it is about
is there a city
100 miles south of San Francisco.
Okay.
Have you heard of Santa Cruz? Big surfing place. It's on the same bay as Santa Cruz. Santa Cruz is at the top. Monterey is down at the bottom. It's known for Pebble Beach, the golf course, right, that everyone always talks about, plays about, one of the best courses in the country.
So where's the Monterey Bay Aquarium in that picture?
Do you have a pointer or anything? Yeah. The mouse? Okay, perfect. So the Monterey Bay Aquarium, see the mouse, is located right around there.
Oh, okay, I see. Okay, cool.
Okay?
Yeah, I understand where I am.
Yep. Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah. So the history of Monterey, so it's not, in California they move water all over the state, but in Monterey it's not connected to any other water systems per se or ways to get water there. So it all relies on local rainfall. The original water supply started back in the 1800s. If you know California history, most of the cities were started by missions. The Catholic Church built missions all up and down the coast. There's a mission in Carmel. Carmel is this community right here. Carmel is also famous for, because that's the town that Clint Eastwood was the mayor of when he had issues with getting things approved, so he became the mayor for a couple of years to change things around. But anyway, Carmel is where the mission was located. The mission needed water. They had an ocean nearby, but they didn't have fresh water, so they went up the river until they found water on the Carmel River. The Carmel River is not a very big river. It's probably less wide than this room. But when it flows hard, it flows hard. Has anyone read Cannery Row by John Steinbeck? Okay. Okay, so in there's a whole discussion about the Carmel River. That's where all that stuff takes place. They talk about dams. That's all this stuff on this river. So it's a kind of a famous river. It's been a river in peril though, so it's had its issues over time. Basically, in the 1880s, we built a dam at this location, and it was a low-head dam, basically just spanned across the river. It put water into a pipe. Water flowed by gravity. This is up at elevation 500. Flowed by gravity from there all the way down to some reservoirs near the ocean, and that's what provided water to all the people who drank there. As time went on, they made a bigger dam at that site called San Clemente Dam. As time went on, they made a bigger dam in the 40s up here. And as population continued to grow, we still didn't have enough water, so they started drilling wells. All these yellow dots represent wells. So basically the Carmel River has an aquifer. It roughly holds 50,000 acre-feet of storage. An acre-foot is 325,000 gallons. The demand in this system was never higher than 20,000 acre-feet a year. So basically, this whole aquifer system was about a couple years worth of water supply. As we moved further south to get water supply, we had iron and manganese issues. Iron and manganese is indicative of a groundwater. So remember, aquifer is underground. And I'm telling you this because it sets up the story. So we have surface waters in the two reservoirs. We have water flowing down the river, filling an aquifer. We're pumping out of that aquifer to provide water to all the customers. But as we got closer to the mouth of the river, more iron and manganese, so that had to be treated, and this is what this big square represents. We had a treatment plant to remove the iron and manganese. As time continued, we started growing in what we call the seaside basin. So this is a groundwater basin, no surface waters, all groundwater. And that provided water for that side of the community. Basically, there's a big ridge going right down the middle between the two watersheds. As seaside continued to grow, we added more wells. This little purple dot represents Sand City. Sand City is a small city of 240 people. That's it. But it's one of the largest commercial developments in the area. And they built their own little brackish water desalination plant. We run that plant for them right now. It makes 300 acre-feet a year. So 300 acre-feet is not very much. About 0.3 million gallons a day. Not very big at all. And then the green dots are aquifer storage and recovery. That's a new concept to Georgia in a way. I think, if my memory's right, down on the coast they banned aquifer storage and recovery because I'm not sure exactly why, but they were nervous about it. But in California, they allow it. Aquifer storage and recovery basically means we take excess water that we have in the wintertime when the flows in the river are real high and strong, and we pump it and inject it into the ground. And then during the summer months when we don't have that, we can pull it back out. So that's kind of the history of our water system in Monterey.
When was the yellow square built?
This would have been probably in the 50s.
Okay, so
50s, 60s. Yeah, and it's pressure vessels with sand, and we feed potassium permanganate, and that takes out the iron and manganese. So pretty simple from an operation perspective, and fairly low cost. None of this was high cost treatment. All right, so this slide dictates where the sources of water came from. So the blue represents surface water. Remember we talked about surface water, right? And the blue, it also corresponds to the color of the dot, right? So that the dams were blue. So back in the beginning of 1916, all the way until 2001, we were mostly surface water from the dams. The yellow represents the aquifer. And what you'll notice here, a couple key points. This one right here, 1977, that's a big drought. That's the drought of record for California. You can see where there wasn't a lot of source supplies, but you also notice we stopped doing the surface water withdrawals. And I'll tell you a little bit why, I'll tell you why in a little bit when we look at the timeline. The red represents Seaside Basin, and then the green is our aquifer storage and recovery wells, and the purple is Sand City. So that's what basically shows where the water comes from. Now, you can ask, what demand was climbing for all these years, and then it came down. Part of the reason the demands did come down is there was a large Army base called Fort Ord. And if you're familiar with what the Army did in the early 1900s, they started this thing called BRAC base. It's basically an Army base closure plan to optimize the use of Army bases around the country. So they closed that, and so a lot of people moved away because all those jobs that supported that base were no longer there. So demands dropped kind of naturally. But also demands have dropped because we've been under a cease and desist order, and I'll talk about that in a subsequent slide. But that's the history of where waters come from. All right, so a little bit on the timeline, just to give you some dates. I was telling Mounty, this project dates back to 1977, believe it or not. So I was 9 years old, 1977, and that's basically the first drought of record. And they realized back then that we have to do something about solving the water supply issue. By 1992, nothing is still done, but another drought occurred, so they started getting concerned. In 1995, this is the key date. So SWRCB stands for the State Water Resources Control Board. One thing you have to realize, in the western states of the U.S., you have to have a water right for any surface water. Okay, so in Georgia, you don't have that. In Georgia, if you want to get a permit for water for anything over 100,000 gallons a day, you go down to Department of Natural Resources and you say, I want a permit for this, and they'll do the studies and they'll tell you yes or no. In California, you have to have a water right. Okay, and water rights are based on who got there first. And there's different types of rights, and I won't, we could spend a whole course on water rights. But the issue is, we had water rights tied to the storage in the dams, but we did not have water rights for all the groundwater we're pumping, because you don't need a water right in California if you're pumping groundwater. And I'll get to a little bit of that in a second. But in 1995, here's what happened. The state determined that the groundwater we were pumping in that Carmel aquifer was not groundwater, it was surface water flowing underground. So you got to wrap your mind around that. What does that mean? Basically means if the surface water, you have to have a water right. We did not have water rights. Now, I told you earlier, we had iron and manganese, which is typically indicative of groundwater, because the reason you have iron and manganese in that is because it's staying in the ground so long, it picks up iron and manganese, right? Anyway, that's the ruling the state made in 1995. What they also did in 1995 is they issued another government entity 29,000 acre feet of new water rights. And they said, go build a dam, and then you'll have plenty of water rights to solve your water supply challenges in the community. Okay, so that local district started the process of building a dam. In 1997, the federal government listed steelhead as threatened. Steelhead is a fish. It's like a salmon, but unlike salmon, salmon, when they go upstream to spawn, they die. Basically, they do that once in their life. They go out to the ocean, live in the ocean, they go up once and they die. Steelhead go back and forth over their life. And it's really an indicator of how healthy a river system is. So the analogous to the Chattahoochee River is, if you're upstream of Atlanta, that's all trout stream. Everything below Beaufort Dam is trout stream, cold temperatures, high dissolved oxygen, healthy river. Everything downstream from Atlanta is no longer a trout stream because the water quality is not as good. The federal government wanted the Carmel River water quality to get back up there. So part of them doing all this was to improve the habitat for steelhead in this river. In 2009, another important date, the state basically said, look, you haven't done anything since 1995. So we're going to issue what they call a cease and desist order. So now a cease and desist order has kind of penalties attached to it. Meaning, and I wasn't the president back then, but as the president of the company, I could go to jail for violating a cease and desist order. Basically, they're saying you don't have the right to use that water. You don't have a surface water right for it. You need to fix the problem. So in 2009, they put us under cease and desist order. In 2010, the PUC approved a regional desal project. And that's different than the project I'm going to talk to you about today, but it's part of the story. But also in 2010, we issued a moratorium on new connections. So think about this. A lot of people don't realize, in the United States of America, where they think, we have everything. In Monterey, we have not added a single new water connection since 2010. So if you owned a vacant lot that your grandparents bought and handed down to you, and you wanted to build your retirement house, you could not do it because we would not issue a meter for that lot. And it's been a tough part for that community to deal with that, because growing communities are better than dying communities. That's just the reality of it, right? All right, in 2012, our company filed for this project I'm going to talk to you about in detail. Now, why the difference? The commission, back up. I'm a regulated water utility, which is different than a government-run utility. City of Atlanta is a government-run utility. A regulated water company is more like Georgia Power, where they're regulated by a Public Utilities Commission in the state. And so everything I do has to be approved by a Public Utilities Commission. The PUC approved a different project. We were working on that project, and we wanted that project to happen, but unfortunately, one of the agencies we were working with paid a board member of another agency kind of under the table, and the whole process of it, all the contracts were determined to be void by the court system. So remember, I'm under a cease and desist order in 2009 that has an end date of 2016. So when that old project failed, I didn't have time to wait around for us to work all that out. We had to do a new project. So in 2012, we filed for this, what we call the Monterey Peninsula Water Supply Project. In 2014, we had another drought. A lot of people heard about the state of California. In April of 2015, we built a test well, a SLANT test well. I'll talk to you a little bit about what that is, but it basically is a well at an angle, 19 degrees below horizontal. And this is kind of a critical part of our project for it to work. And we did this test well because a lot of people said that project wouldn't work and this well wouldn't work. But we installed it in April of 2015. We turned it on. It ended up running, making 2,000 gallons a minute for over 600 days. So it worked. Conceptually, our project could work. July 16 was our original deadline. We knew we weren't going to meet that. So we actually went back to the State Water Resources Control Board and asked for permission to extend it. So the new cease and desist order deadline is 2021. So that's my new target that I'm trying to get this project built by. In 2016, our commission approved a portion of our project called the Pure Water Monterey Project. I'll show you that in the next slide, what that is. And in 2018, last year, the commission finally approved our project. So we now have permission to go. Our company, we spent about $100 million so far on this project, getting us to where we are today. We have another $200 million to go. It's not a cheap project by any means, but that's where we are. Any questions as I keep going? All right, so we'll get a little more detail. All right, so what is our project comprised of? Desalination, and I'll talk a little bit about that, but we need to make 6,252 acre feet. Pure Water Monterey, this is basically a recycling water project. Has anyone here heard of the F. Wayne Hill plant up in Gwinnett County? It's basically the big, large wastewater facility in North Gwinnett. It does the same thing this project does. The slight difference is instead of injecting this water, it injects into the ground and we pull it out as potable. The F. Wayne Hill project in Gwinnett County injects water into Lake Lanier at the top end of Lake Lanier, and then you have that entire volume of water to dilute that product. So that's basically called indirect potable reuse. Okay. So that's a key component. This type of project is cheaper than desalination because it doesn't require as much energy. It still has similar components: reverse osmosis membranes, oxidation, chlorine treatment, but it's a different component. So we agreed to do basically a portfolio approach because we've realized desalination is the most energy intensive and probably the most environmentally non-friendly of these options. So this was our project. ASR stands for Aquifer Storage and Recovery. What we wanted to do with aquifer storage and recovery is we want the desalination plant to run the same load all day, every day for the entire year. But demands don't work that way. Just like you can imagine, here the summertime demands in Atlanta are a lot higher than the wintertime demands. But we want the plant to run the same. So when we have excess supply, we inject it into the ground, and when we need more supply, we pull it out of the ground. So that's what
lead to lead and manganese poisoning, or lead and manganese levels being higher because
it depends on the groundwater. It depends on, yes, but so that's why we don't have aquifer storage recovery facilities everywhere. But when you're siting those, you look at those kind of components. And you would make a decision, if I do have lead manganese in that product, do I want to continue doing that, or would I want to treat that? Is that still the most efficient use of that water? Is that the most cost effective? We don't have any issues with lead, iron and manganese, excuse me, for our ASR stuff. We do actually have a what we call a trihalomethane issue. So trihalomethane, it's a long-term carcinogen. So everyone in the U.S., there's a chlorine residual in your water. If your water utility is not run properly, that chlorine residual can degrade and create these long-term carcinogens. And so all the water companies around the U.S. have to tell their residents and their customers what's in their water, and they do that, what they call a consumer confidence report. If you're well run, it's not an issue, but if you're poorly run, it can be an issue. When we first started injecting water, we had some issues with that. So what we ended up determining is we just had to let it sit in there longer, because Mother Nature is actually the best cleaner of everything, right? Yeah, you certainly know that from the ocean perspective as well. So she takes care of it ultimately. All right, so I won't spend a ton of time on this, but the benefits of our project, we restore the Carmel River. So right now, remember, I maybe didn't do a great job of this. When we pump real hard in the summer times, there's no water flowing in the river. It truly is an underground river. So if you're a fish, what are you supposed to do in the summertime? You get stranded. There's actually a rearing facility where people go out and rescue steelhead, and they put them to a little place where they rear them and let them sit until the river flows come back. So ultimately, this project, that's the Carmel River. Not very big. 100,000 people relying on that water source to live. We replenish the Seaside Basin. That's the groundwater basin that we also pull water from. Now, the key with desal is typically there's two impacts. There's the ocean impact of pulling ocean water into your facilities. You can either entrain fish or impinge them. That's why we're doing a subsurface. Those issues go away. And the outfall, the brine disposal. So brine is basically when you make desal, it takes twice as much water coming in. To, two gallons coming in, 1 gallon going out is finished water. But all that brine you pulled out gets put back into that other gallon. So it's twice as strong. So how do you put that back into the ocean environment without causing harm? And I'll talk a little bit about that. And then desalination is typically a pretty big energy user. So we co-located our facility next to a landfill. Landfill has methane gas power generation, and so we're going to tap into that to help reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. All right, this is a little bit on this. We're an investor-owned utility, so one of the concerns that from folks that we serve water to is that we're not as transparent about all of our costs versus a public government entity. So we agreed to do a governance committee, so all of our costs are shared to the public. We allowed public investment to come in to help reduce the cost of our project. Environmental benefits. There's 22 parties, and it's not a lawsuit per se, but when you're at the commission trying to get approval, parties can intervene and they get to weigh in on the process. So we had 22 intervening parties. We were able to settle with 16 of them. So that's pretty phenomenal. And I know you're in Georgia and you've not heard a lot of these firms, but have you anyone heard of the Sierra Club? Okay, pretty popular. They're one of the selling parties. So they bought into what we're doing because they believe it's benefit to the Carmel River and we're doing a desal the correct way. Land Watch is typically an anti-growth group, but they bought into it because they like the way we're doing our project. Citizens for Public Water they're mostly concerned about the rates and the cost impact, and the Planning and Conservation League is all about protecting the environment. So we got great support from these folks to move forward with our project. All right, so this is a little bit of a history. This is where we were, Seaside Basin and Carmel River, providing all the water, and that's where we're going to. So desalination will be 40%. Groundwater replenishment, which is at Pure Water Monterey, would be 22%. ASR, just the makeup. So more diversified portfolio of water. All right, let's get into the project components. All right, so the top part is cost. We agreed to build two size plants. Well, sorry, I should say, we agreed to study or design 2 plants, and then if the Pure Water Monterey project happened, the recycled water project component, then we'd make our desal smaller. And that's actually what's occurred. The commission ordered us to do that project. But it's $329 million is the total cost. The bottom cost is the O&M cost per year. So it's basically $19 million a year is what it costs to run this facility. Power is the biggest component of that, $7 million a year just to pay the power bill. Labor, I forgot, basically 15 to 20 staff that I got to pay their, just like anything, you pay their wages, you pay their salaries, you pay their retirement plan, you pay their benefits. And then we have some miscellaneous costs. So it's $3 million a year for that. Like any facility, you have to repair and replace things, right? So we have budget for that. I'm buying water. So that's $6 million of purchasing water from someone else. And then we have a lease. The outfall, which is that kind of yellowish line, that's owned by someone else. That's how we're going to dispose of the brine. I'll talk a little bit about that, but we have to pay them a lease. All right, so here are the components. With this, we talked about this is the area of the aquarium, roughly. So give scale between that point and where the plant is located is about 20 miles. So we have to build about 20 miles of new pipelines to move water from where the desalination plant is going to be sited. Now, why did we put the plant 20 miles away? It has to do with the SLANT wells, the intake wells, and I'll talk about that on the next slide. But they have to be located where the geology works. If you've been to that part of Monterey, it's pretty rocky. You go down maybe 30, 40 feet and you're solid rock. So it's not gonna work for the intake system we want. The red represents the SLANT wells. Basically, water goes from the SLANT wells up to the plant. The plant is kind of represented by the blue. We showed the kind of the vessels. The blue pipeline's all the new pipeline. The recycle water project called Pure Water Monterey is the purple pipe. We're taking that water. We're also injecting it into the ground. And in California, for indirect potable reuse, you have to have an environmental buffer. So basically, it needs to sit in the ground for 6 months. Then we can pull it out as potable water. So that recycled water. It's basically it's a fear, to be honest with you. We're not quite to direct potable reuse. That's going to happen in our lifetimes, but we're not there yet. So the regulations in California say you need an environmental barrier. So think
what happens in the environment?
Well, Mother Nature cleans things up. So as water moves through the ground, it cleans up. So here's a good example. Wastewater treatment plants, one of the things they do is they remove pathogens, right? And typically use chlorine as one of the items, and you monitor for that. But what if you're going from a wastewater effluent right into the influent or right into a pipeline? What if you have a failure of that system?
I thought in Paris that's what they do, right?
No.
No, I thought the city of Paris had this.
The only place they have filtration, yes, but that's all on the potable side. But they're not taking the wastewater effluent and going right into the drinking water pipes.
Oh,
Everything's still separate. The only country that's really doing that in a heavy way is Singapore. Singapore, because it's my island. There are a couple of facilities in Texas now that do direct potable reuse, and every state has different rules. In Texas, their direct potable reuse, the effluent from the wastewater plant goes to the influent of the water treatment plant, so it still has more barriers to get through. No one's going from the effluent of a wastewater plant to the pipes, the drinking water pipes. Not yet. It will happen in our lifetime because we can treat that water to very, very high standards. And then we just need to build in the safeguards. But right now, California says 6 months. Now, to get to more detail, 6 months is like, if you propose a 6 month buffer, you don't have to do anything else. If you want that buffer to be shorter, then you have to create a scientific panel, and they would have to go through the whole process and determine if that's still safe. So you can shorten it if you want to.
Okay.
All right. So this is a picture of a slant well. It's kind of vertical exaggeration. You understand that, but basically, the components of a vertical well are no different, except we're drilling a well at an angle, and there's equipment that we call a dual rotary type of equipment that we advance an outside casing. We pull the material out from it, then we'll put in our new well piping and our gravel pack around it, and we'll have basically a well, no different than a vertical well. Now, the reason we're doing this, you remember this is geometry class, right? If I have a vertical well that is, let's say, 200 feet deep, I only get so much foot of screen. Remember, the water's got to flow in the screen to get to the well motor to pump to the plant. But if I have this 700 foot long to 1,000 foot long at that angle, instead of getting 200 feet of screen, I may have, and I can't do the math in my head, but over 500 feet of screen. So I can have a better drawdown characteristic. So when you turn a well on underground, the water flows from high elevation to low elevation, right? It creates this like underground tent, if you will, driving water towards the well. A slant well changes that shape and you don't have as much drawdown. So it's a benefit to the groundwater supply. Now, the other thing we wanted to do with this project is we want the source to be the ocean. We don't want to capture inland water. We want the water coming from the ocean. So when I originally proposed this project back in 2012, I had actually cited the wellhead to be on the beach. But what I didn't fully appreciate was that there's a snowy plover, which is an endangered bird, that lives on that beach. And we could not get the permits because of their nesting season to do anything on the beach. They said, nope, non-starter, not going to happen. So if I had started my well here, I would have had 1,000 foot of well underneath the ocean. So I couldn't go there. Now the next thing is dunes in California are sacred. You're not allowed to disturb sand dunes. That's just the reality of it. So in this location, the sand dunes are 2,000 feet thick. Well, if I went 2,000 feet back, my technology is I can only go about 1,000 feet max. So I would launch that. I wouldn't get out under the ocean floor, which is what I'm trying to do, which means I would have more inland water captured. And I'll talk to you why that's an issue here in a second. But ultimately what we did is I got all the regulators in one room. 30 different agencies. And I said, hey, I'm under a cease and desist order. I have to have a solution. Tell me where I can put my wells. Next slide. So there's an old sand mining facility that's been grandfathered. Cemex, if you've heard, is a big aggregate company. They have a sand mining operation in Monterey. And if you've been there, I don't know if you're driving in from Castroville, there's an old facility. You can see the smokestack running on the beach.
Oh, yeah.
That's it. Okay?
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. In fact, I actually was wondering what that was. Yeah,
it's a sand mining operation, and that sand is high quality sand that's very good from a chemical reaction perspective. It doesn't cause corrosion. It's a great silica product. It's used all over the world, and then they ship it all over the world. It's also led to coastal erosion issues, and so ultimately that plant's going to shut down. But they had disturbed a massive amount of area along the coast. So everyone said, Rich, you need to be in their active mining area, then we'll let you get closer. So that's what we did. So this is our layout that's proposed for these wells. Each blue line represents the well line. Now these dotted lines, and I have another picture, those represent coastal erosion rates that could happen. There's been a lot of studies on coastal erosion with sea level rise and climate change. So we had to account for that in our layout of our wells. Each well can roughly do 2,000 gallons a minute. I have 7 of them I need for the small plant, 10 of them I need for the big plant with some redundant wells. We did a test well I talked about earlier. That's this line up here. That's the one that we've already got up and running and proved the concept. Now remember, why are we doing slant wells? No impact to marine life, right? I'm filtering all the ocean water through the sand floor, so I don't, you're not going to suck a fish swimming to the ocean floor, which is what happens with an open ocean intake, or you're not going to suck a fish inside a pipe that can get then chopped up by a pump. Similarly, you're not going to take larvae into that pipe. So this is the preferred method, and a couple agencies in California have said you have to prove subsurface is infeasible before you're allowed to go to an open ocean intake. Our site, we have 200 feet of sand. It works at this site. If I move 10 miles north or 10 miles south, I don't have a site that works. So that's why we're located where we're located. There's a bunch of other desalination projects going on in California, and the state wants them to look at this technology for them, but it doesn't necessarily fit all locations. Our plant also happens to be a size where this would work. Some of people may be familiar with Huntington Beach. They're trying to do a 50 million gallon per day desalination plant, and they've been asked to do a subsurface intake. This is what I need for roughly 10 million gallons a day, so I would need 5 times more than that. This area from here to here is almost a mile. So if you need 5 times that, you need 5 miles of oceanfront property in Huntington Beach, not going to happen, right? There's just no way. So this project works at this location.
And this is what Huntington Beach if it's not feasible.
They'll do an open ocean intake.
So they will do that.
Yeah, they'll allow that, and then they just have to do different mitigation for that. So they'll need screens that are very, very tight. They'll need the velocities coming into those screens to be so low that a fish can't get stuck to it. And that just adds cost because you're building everything big for this really slow velocity. But the larvae thing is still an issue, right? And so they'll have to mitigate that somehow. All right, so here's a cross section of the predicted coastal erosion at this site. The green line represents where our well is, and this red dotted line represents the year 2060. Now, ocean environments, you guys know, right? You're studying this, super aggressive, right? So I don't know of a material that will last 100 years. There probably are. And maybe they're creating them, but we're using a super duplex steel that we believe will last at least 30 years. And that's what our test well was built out of. By mistake, we actually had one of the bolts we used in the pump column was like a 3/16 stainless steel bolt. It didn't make it, 4 months. I mean, it held on for a while, but it didn't make it. And then we had to pull the pump out, we put the right bolt on there, and it worked. But we designed this at every 20 years. Basically, we'll recompute where we are and move the wells inlet if need be. From a drinking water perspective, I need to have 50 feet of sand covering my well to get with treatment credit, and that's a whole other subject matter. But the bottom line is, if I have less than 50 feet of cover, then I'll start exploring moving this well inland.
Are you taking earthquakes into account at all?
Yep. Yeah. So in the EIR process, earthquakes are all part of it, and this area has some liquefaction potential. But ultimately, this well is so long and so deep, it doesn't really affect it. And remember, the motor is just sitting in there, kind of floating around. So as long as we have, it's a 36-inch. It's a telescoping slant well. So we start at 36 at the very top, and then by the end of it, we're 12-inch. So it's just like a radio antenna. Yep.
I would expect it to be much bigger.
No, but I've got a lot of length, so I'm just trying to get flow to come in.
Yeah, I understand.
Yep. And that's what the test well was built. The test well was 36 M. Yes, sir.
How do you calculate the shoreline stream?
How did I? So I sent to Manu some background material. So the EIR for this project, they go through all the science. That's not above my area of expertise, is how they do that. But there is a memo on how they determine this. Yeah, if you're interested in that kind of stuff. And there's been a lot of study in this area because the coast has been eroding quite significantly. Remember I talked to you about Fort Ord, the base that closed? They used to have an officers club that was on the cliff, and it was built in like the 1920s. By 1975, 1980, it basically was about to fall in. So it was, it basically is eroded away over time. So they've seen it. It does occur. But yeah, if he has some documents, and I also have a website I can kind of guide you to that has all that stuff if you really want to get into the details. I think the EIR, so the Environmental Information Review, the EIR, Environmental Impact Report, excuse me, it's over 10,000 pages. Yeah, it costed me $12 million to make that thing. All right, so that's coastal erosion, so we try to take that into account. Interestingly enough, though, I mean, the floor doesn't change much. Right, it just starts working its way in. And then some of the dotted line is a storm, and the kind of the solid line is kind of like the base. And we've seen examples of that. There's an outfall that goes out to the same site that has an access manhole. And when we did our test well, we had to connect our line into that manhole so we could just pump in a circle. When we put that line in there, that manhole had 10 feet of sand on top. We had a storm 2 years ago, and that manhole was sitting 6 feet out of the ground. So we moved in one storm 16 feet of sand. Pretty powerful. And I was talking to one of my colleagues. This year, it's about a foot of sand back on top of the manhole. So it put back about 7 feet of sand. So it's a lot of ocean stuff going on. All right, so this next slide has to do with the groundwater impact. So remember, I told you earlier, I'm trying to capture as much ocean water as possible. But there's a law in this location of California that says any groundwater that I capture from inland sources has to stay in that watershed. It can't leave the watershed. My customers are outside this watershed. Okay, so there's what we call return water obligation. So we settled with the parties on how we would do that. This is basically a kind of a schematic. What's the right word? The hydraulic grade line of the groundwater levels. This is a huge agricultural community. Salinas Valley is one of the most fertile agricultural spaces in California. If you ever had an artichoke, it came from here, because I think it's the only place where they grow artichokes. But a very, very long history of farming. they've been pumping this groundwater basin really, really hard for many, many years. So saltwater intrusion has occurred. And if you go about 7 miles inland, there's a hint of salt in the water there. So it has affected the water quality. And that's what this gradient shows. That's the kind of, as you move inland, the groundwater levels have dropped. And then this bottom picture shows what our project does, how it affects that. So we have the slant well, that's this line here. Water's going to flow towards the well. It does lower this line in this location. And the idea is by the time you get way out here, the difference is not that much. And that's what this red line represents on this graph here. That's where we would lower, our project would lower the groundwater table by a foot. Now, why is that important? Basically in California and in many states, if I affect your well, if you have an existing well and I come in and I drill a well next to it and I affect you, you can sue me because you've changed what you had. I've damaged your property. Typically a foot is to the point where you say, I didn't really damage you, right? And I can make you whole through the lawsuit either by water or dollars, or I could fix your well. So let's say you had a well right here, right? And I'm affecting you by that distance, and let's say it's 10 feet. If the water quality is the same, then I would pay you, okay, you have to pump 10 feet more water. I can compute what that is in cost. I'll just give you a check, right? That's one resolution. Or I could say, I'll pay for a new well, you can drill deeper, and you're made whole. So that's what, that's basically, it's a mitigation. So we had to study that quite a bit. The goal is to get as much ocean water as possible because I don't want to return water, right? I want to use it all. But we're all these intervening parties, there's still some disagreement on this. This is actually one of the most challenging aspects of the project. We hired a group of experts. We call them the hydrogelic working group. And interestingly, I got a Stanford guy and a Berkeley PhD guy kind of going at it. But the idea is to work out, we wanted the science to dictate what was happening as opposed to the politics, because politics does get in the way a lot sometimes. And so we created this working group to work through all these issues, and they basically came out with a final paper to say this works. And we're comfortable with all this. We're comfortable with how you're going to mitigate it. We're comfortable that you're not going to impact the basin long term. And remember, if I am taking water inland, I'm going to actually give it back to someone in the basin. They're going to pump less, so that actually has a benefit to the basin. So all that's been worked out on this project, and we spent quite a bit of time. Just for information, these blue lines kind of represent, kind of the flow net of water flowing to those wells. So if the water originates from the ocean, that's good. I don't have to return that. But if water, like a particle of water from this location moved in towards the well, I have to keep that back in the basin. All right.
So complicated, these water rules.
Yes. All right, so this is just an example of monitoring wells. And each of these monitoring wells has, we have instrumentation in them. We have people downloading the instrumentation. We've made all this information public on our website so people can't say we're manipulating data. It's all out there in the public. But this is an example of what the monitoring wells look like. We have 3 wells because each one goes to a different aquifer. We have one going shallow, so basically from the ground to the first aquitard. An aquitard is basically a clay layer, if you will, that separates different aquifers if you go down vertically. We have one in the middle. It goes down basically from that 200 to 400, and then we have one going to the 400. And this is our test well. And we put a monitoring well here, monitoring well here, monitoring well here. And then we went further out, here, there, and there. So we were monitoring everything because we wanted to know what the true impact of our test well was. And the way the benefit of having a test well is, we create groundwater models. And the model's a model, right? So how do you calibrate the model? So basically by having live data where we had a well pulling a known volume and we had measurements on all these monitoring wells, we're able to calibrate that model best we could.
So how was your first iteration of the model when you first looked at the data? Was it?
It was actually because these experts, these 4 scientists that we hired to do this, or basically the hydrogeologists, they know this basin. They've worked in this basin pretty much their entire careers. And so they started off pretty good. And the first runs were decent. No real issues. However, because this is Monterey and just because people are involved, a retired Princeton professor came, who as a professor of economics, so he said he's good with numbers. He accused us and accused the modelers of rigging the data to our benefit. And so he threw that out in the process, and no one really knew how to dispute what he said because he's a PhD Princeton guy who knows numbers. So we ended up the commission hired Lawrence Livermore Labs to do an independent peer review of all the modeling work to say, yes, everything was done right. And then on top of that, then the commission hired another expert to do all the modeling work that went in the final EIR.
So it seems like there's also some issues of trust then.
Yes.
Why is it so? Is it like a historical thing that,
Do you remember the Mark Twain quote, "Whiskey's for drinking, water's for fighting"? I mean, everyone wants their water. They don't want to lose it. And they're worried about it. And so everyone thinks someone has a hidden agenda or you're manipulating something to benefit you. That's just the reality of it.
It's been like this, in every single country, in every single state, this mistrust always.
Yeah, so that's why we created the Hydro Working Group. So just the background, I paid for 2 of the experts, the company, and then the Salinas Valley agriculture community, they paid for 2 of the experts. Because if you're paying someone, some people would always argue, well, they're going to be biased to the person who's employing them. And a true scientist says they're not biased, and we get that. But are they? You're being paid by someone to do something, right? And so that's why we said, okay, well, let's have the different parties pay for their representatives. And they came out with the answer. Now, our commission approved this project, but there's still a community next to us that doesn't believe our science is correct. And so they're challenging me right now. That's just one of the realities that we're working through with them. It's not complex math, but this is as complicated as it gets. We have to return any inland water. So it's just a simple salinity calculation based on percentages. And so whatever we agreed that's the formula we're going to use because we didn't want people to say we were manipulating the formula to benefit us versus them. So we agreed that's the formula we're going to use. And some people have argued to me, Rich, that's not the correct way to do a mass balance. And I said, oh, no. This is what we all settled on. This is the formula. No ifs, ands, or buts. That's the formula, right? And basically it says the ocean water salinity in this area, and you guys probably know this better than I do, but it's about 33,500 milligrams a liter, which is actually not as strong as it could be in parts of the world. And that's influenced because of the rivers that do dump into that bay, but it's 33,500. So if you go through the numbers, that's the number we used. And salty water and drinking water is considered 500. So that's what the 500 is based for. So what basically 33,005 times X plus the local groundwater at 500, what percentage those come together, we solve for what the inland percentage is. Whatever that is, we return. So surprising how hard it took to get all the parties to agree to that, but that's the math.
I'm actually not surprised at all.
Yeah. But, all right, so that was the groundwater. Now we're going to transition to, how are we doing on time? Oh, okay, I gotta speed it up. All right, so now we're transitioning to the brine. So that's the other key part that has worries for folks is what are you going to do with the brine? So I'm proud to say that, I don't know if anyone knows Phil Roberts, professor here at Georgia Tech. This is his work. So he was hired by the EIR team to look at this. This came right out of his study. This one here is actually another consultant did the work as well, but the PUC hired a couple of different experts. But the idea with brine is California has some rules on how to handle brine discharge. Remember, it's twice the strength of the ocean. So if the ocean is 33.5, the way we're running our plant, it won't be quite double. It's going to be a little bit less than double, but it's going to be around 60,000. So that's the brine. So that jet, so we have an outfall that we're going to use. It's a wastewater outfall that has diffuser ports located every so many feet for the last 1,000 feet. It goes 2 miles out into the bay. I have another picture that shows that here. And they modeled the plume. Now, what we've learned is the fish are very smart. When they start swimming and they get in this jet, they said, this is a bit nasty, and they keep going. So there's no issue with that part of it. But when that plume comes and hits the ocean floor, all the benthic life there, they can't move. They're stuck. Yeah. So the California rules say I need to be within 2,000 milligrams a liter by the time I hit that area. Do you know Dr. Carol Reed?
Yeah.
For Hopkins. Okay, so her and I got into a lively discussion about this because she goes, Rich, you're creating circles of death, right? That's the term she used, where this would come and hit the ocean floor. I said, well, let's model it. Let's figure out what's going to happen. So they did show that if we design this right, it will be, instead of being at 2,000, we'll be at 1,600. That gives a little bit of a barrier, a buffer. Okay? And then what
We're talking about what distances here?
So they have what they call a zone of initial dilution, right? So this is about 100 meters, roughly.
I mean, it's interesting to me because, if you think of all the damage that we keep doing with all this seabed dragging and stuff, that's a lot more. Here we're talking about one area. Okay, you damage it once, but once you damage it, it's not, they're not going to regrow. The vent is not going to regrow.
Well, she was worried that you would, and I think they studied a lot of this in the Gulf of Mexico, where because of it's so flat and you have these pools, that it could sit there and concentrate and create a lot more bigger issues. So that was looked at near distance and far distance exposures. Yep. And so so basically we think we're covered. We think based on the modeling and the way the outfall is designed, we're fine. Now Dr. Roberts took it a step further and said, well, what if we change the angle of the diffuser? And what you find here is this is the most optimum. So what happens is as it goes up, so remember my brine is twice as dense. So wastewater wants to float, brine water wants to sink. So if you shoot it up, you get the benefit of a longer, slightly longer, and that area gets a lot bigger. So the dilution would be better. If you make it too steep though, what you find is it comes in and falls back on itself. So it actually doesn't get better. So this is kind of the optimum angle. So we have a fallback position. This is our existing ports now. They're basically 180 degrees out. If we find over time that it's not working properly, we can modify. And we agree to do that with some of the settling parties, that if that's an issue, we can modify that.
How would you know if it's not working out?
Next slide, here we go. So, good question. So I agreed to put in these devices. Basically, these are, Teledyne makes these, but they're basically groundwater, well, they're monitoring stations that will locate at these locations. This is the outfall. And the diffuser ports are located in this last section here. We have one right there near the outfall. Boom, boom, boom. And we'll see what's happening.
But the outfall is not there yet, right?
It's there. It was built for the wastewater treatment plant back in the 80s.
Oh, okay. So
yes.
Okay, I see.
And most of the wastewater is being diverted for inland crop irrigation. So it doesn't have, so we had to model it worst case brine only. But sometimes of the year it would be brine and wastewater, which would help the dilution. But yeah, so we'll have these devices in there. And the way these things work is basically there's a salinity monitor recording the data. And then when it's nearing time that it needs to get recorded, it shoots a canister up to the top and we retrieve it, download the data, put it back. So it's a manual operation. But in technology, hopefully will catch up to us one day where we don't have to do that. Yeah.
What's what kind of depths are we looking at?
Oh, we're right around just around 100 feet. Yeah, not super deep. There is a deep trench that is off of Monterey, but it's a lot further north than we are. And in this aerial photo, you don't quite see it. But if you ever go to Google Earth in this part of the site, you'll see where that deep trench is.
Did you do any modeling of sorry to keep this, did
No.
you do any modeling of the local currents in this area?
Yes.
With the brines?
Yeah, there's, and this is not my area of expertise, but there's 3 prevailing currents, and they looked at how this would be affected under those 3 different current scenarios. And in the documents I sent Manu earlier, that's discussed, those different current types. Okay. Yeah. All right, I'm actually on my last slide, so yes.
Is there a reason why you didn't move brine into stuff like an evaporative salt pond or anything like that?
So great question. It's this land area, and a lot of folks didn't want a big industrialized salt mining operation. A couple of inventors came by and say, hey, we have a way to make this into salt and we could have a product out of it. When we started talking to them, that was a $300 million project as well. So who pays for that? I already got customers who pay for this $300 million. It was just, we couldn't make it work. And then part of the land use areas, this has been the sand mining operation for years, and it has a big smokestack, and it's, kind of people think it's ugly. They didn't want something else coming back that looked to be problematic. All right, so I know we're right at 4, but I'm on my last slide. All right, so this is a kind of conceptual design of our plant with the process diagram up top. But the slant wells go to cartridge filters. The cartridge filters are located in this area. We go to pretreatment first, which is basically pressure filters with sand. Because we're doing slant wells, our water quality coming in is already very, very good. Of course, it's high salinity, but we don't have a lot of issues we got to deal with. We go through cartridge filters to protect the RO membranes. This building here is our RO membrane building. These are the different storage tanks. Backwash water from these units is what these ponds are. And this pond here is a brine pond, but it's not there for evaporation purposes. It's the outfall several hours of the year doesn't have capacity, so we need to have a low equalization pond. So that's what that pond's for. But that's basically.
This is a sketch of a map. This is not there.
This is our 3D modeling of our plant that we hope to be building in about 6 months. Yeah, that's so. CDM Smith is our design builder, and as an aside, we paid $50,000 to Cal Poly, which is one of the trade schools in California. Not as good as Georgia Tech, but it's a good school. Anyway, sorry I had to say that. We hired their architecture students to come do some conceptual design models for us, and what we did is we took their work and we put it in the RFP process for the desal plant itself. And so the designers knew kind of the themes we liked. So they picked up on that, and that's kind of the finished product.
That's pretty nice.
Yeah, so that's an $87 million facility. All right, and then I put on my last slide just a little bit about me, if you're curious, because I was a civil engineering graduate from Georgia Tech. 1986 is when I started. I graduated in 4 years. I worked at a company called Wiedemann Singleton for a while. Grew through the ranks. I got my professional license. Then this was in the early 90s. Probably don't remember, but the economy wasn't very good, so I had to look for where the work was. But ultimately, I came to American Water, which is the company I'm at now, right in this time frame. I started in Lexington, Kentucky, and I went to grad school while there because I worked and lived in the same school where Kentucky was, and I did a lot of modeling work, basically hydraulic transient modeling. That's how I got my master's at Kentucky. I left American Water for a little bit, but then I came back to California American Water in 2010. I led the engineering team, which was this project basically. Then I went to operations, and I became president about 2 years ago. So just a little bit of my story. All right, that's it. Thanks.
That's impressive.
Yeah, covered a lot of ground. Appreciate your
Does your
listening.
company do any R&D work at all?
We do.
So particularly on the treatment side. So you're talking about reverse osmosis, but there's lots of academic work being done and kind of this. I mean, there's literally just a poster session here actually.
Yeah, I was there.
Yeah.
I think you served me some beers, if that's my memory is right.
No, today.
Oh, I missed that one. Oh, okay.
Today it was an environmental engineering poster session.
Okay, sorry.
There's just a lot of work being done.